All right, well, I'd like to welcome all of you, those of you here in person and those of us joining on Zoom, to the 10th Jon Goldstein Memorial Lecture in Environmental Economics. Now, it's the 10th lecture, which nowadays that's actually a diamond anniversary. You want to do something special. And indeed, this year is special. Our speaker is Dr. Richard Sandor, and tonight's conversation will be around his recent book, co-authored with Paula DiPerna. See it? Carbon Hunters, Reflections and Forecasts for Climate Markets in the 21st Century. And some of you may have picked up a copy. I think there's still some left, and the format will be a fireside chat. So I'm very proud to say that Richard earned his PhD in economics right here at the University of Minnesota. Yeah, here. He was a classmate of Jon Goldstein, who also received his PhD here, and whose work in environmental economics was ahead of its time. And I'd like to acknowledge Jon's family, who are some of them joining us on Zoom tonight, and to say how much it means to Minnesota economics that we are able to celebrate Jon's legacy in this way. And especially this year, given Richard and his wife Ellen, their leadership in helping create this event. And on the subject of Ellen, if you read this book, you're a sort of a leading character in this book, I have to say. And one detail I particularly enjoyed was this, and this is a quote from the book. When Richard was considering where to get his PhD, he knew Minnesota was strong in theory and policy, and as we are today. These academic strengths, coupled with a generous financial package, led him to accept Minnesota's offer of admission. And truth be told, the financial stability enabled him to marry Ellen Simon, the love of his life. Yeah. And I have to say, what a great use of a graduate student financial package, right? I mean, to get both you and to get you together. So really, I was going to say, welcome you both. I think we should, both Ellen and Richard here today. So, the issue of climate change and how to limit carbon emissions, central issue of our time, where a carbon hunter would play a crucial role. Richard Sandor is a carbon hunter extraordinaire. And there's another name for Richard from Time magazine, the father of carbon markets. Okay? So hunter, father, really making a big impact on one of the most important issues of our time. Now, let's go back to your start here in Minnesota. You were influenced by Leo Hurwitz, great theorist, your advisor, J. Smookler, very much hands-on, and you worked on the economics of invention and patents, important questions. Where do the innovations come from? Small firms, big firms. You were a successful academic. You got a great job. You went to the University of California, Berkeley, one of the most prestigious universities in the whole world, and you plied the trade of an academic, continuing from the outside to look in at what those inventors were doing. And somewhere along the way, you got in there, you became one of those inventors, right? And creating new products, right? And financial products in particular. I mean, of course, you're right there close to Silicon Valley and all the stuff, the technology changes, which you ended up using, right? You don't miss a trick, right? Obviously, this open outcry, all these hands flying around, you could see then that was going down the drain, and you use this stuff. But I think your main thing was not how people trade, but what they trade, right? And futures markets and agricultural products, corn, pork bellies, that must be 100 years. But nowhere was there trade in, say, an interest rate a year from now in a futures market. And you invented that. In fact, you're also called the father of financial futures. So when you add in the father of the carbon markets and the biological children, by the way, I mean, you've really been busy on the paternity front. Now, getting back to carbon hunters, you had the insight that the same principles that you were applying to create markets for interest rates and so forth, and creating financial derivatives. I mean, you coined that term. Also applied, could be used to solve environmental problems. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But there's a prequel, right? The focus will be carbon dioxide. Well, sulfur dioxide was another big deal. And I remember when I was young, acid rain was one of the real big scourges. And the trees were, forests dying, people dying, and economics and creating markets for sulfur dioxide made a difference. And it turns out you had your fingerprints in that too, right? And so that's where I'm going to start now and ask questions, but that's where we're going to lead off here. So I'll pose a question and then just be you.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So the success of acid rain is now a segue into carbon markets, but how did you get interested in the acid rain program, and what key factors made that program successful, and what lessons from that experience shaped your thinking about the design of carbon markets?
I got interested in that not for my own curiosity, but I actually got a call from a coalition of lime producers, because lime is a sludge that takes sulfur as a gas, and when you pass it through lime, it basically takes the sulfur out of it. So there was a pending act before Congress in 1989 and 90 called the Clean Air Act and its amendments. And in that act, they foresaw trading. They didn't say trading, actually. They allowed you to comply by having emissions credits in your account if your account was not equal to the amount of emissions. So you could supplement your requirements by having these environmental credits in the account. So somebody said to me, well, you commoditized interest rates, can you commoditize air? You know, is that possible? And I said, sure. They said, would you write a position paper for what was called CARE, the Coalition for Acid Rain Equity, which was a trade group to sell lime. I say shamelessly. So I consulted with them, and I said, this could be based on standard metrics. If you take a look at the amount of corn produced and multiply it by X, you get futures volume. So I said, given there are 18 million tons, that's the crop. If you turned over that crop 20 times, by and large, you'd get something as large as wheat futures, which was surprising to everybody. And I said, there's financial incentives here. And so I participated in drafting, or the input to drafting, along with lots of other people, advocated in the Senate to people I had known because of my prior work in advocating the creation of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and the act passed. And I went on to, I was on the board of directors of the Chicago Board of Trade. I said to the exchange, you ought to really consider trading a futures contract on this. Why don't you form a committee? And so I formed a committee, and the committee had some fun people like Jim Thompson, who was the former governor of Illinois. He got all excited. He said, come on, we're going to go see Bill Riley, who was then head of the EPA. And I flew into Washington with Jim, and we briefed Michael Boskin, who was then the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisory. And I said to Bill, you got some major problems here. And I said, there's asymmetric information. Only the utilities know how much SO2 are putting out. You'll never get traders or market makers because it's all asymmetric. The utilities are going to pound them because they have information that the traders don't have. So he said, which I didn't realize, there's something called a technical correction, which is basically if you screw up as a legislator, you put in a little asterisk and say, I meant to say you need to have continuous emission monitors put on the smokestacks so that there'd be immediate information available on how much emission. So we developed I ended up being a bit of a kitchen cabinet form, ended up on the SO2 advisory, because they didn't know about things like QSIP numbers or securities. They had no idea. It had been drafted with the input of very well-meaning people, but people who didn't understand capital markets or futures prices or intertemporal pricing or things like that. So I played a role, and we ended up doing the first trade in SO2 allowances, my company, and it was really not a trade. And it's a very important lesson because we have economists here to do it. So nobody knew what the price should be. How do you figure out what it was? The government was going to hold an auction, but it hadn't held the auction. So how do you take a commodity like acid rain allowances, the right to emit, and how do you price it? Some people said it was $900 a ton, the United Mine Workers, econometric forecasting shop said $400, the fine was $2,000. So we went to a utility, and in Henderson, Kentucky, that was building a scrubber using lime to suck out the acid out of the flue gas emissions. And we said to him, hold on, you're borrowing money, you're leveraging yourself. It's Henderson, Kentucky, you're in poverty, you're sitting on a gold mine, and don't borrow money. I will buy 20 years of your allowances, which you will be entitled to, and I'll forward price it, and I'll present value. Nothing very fancy, just meat and potatoes economics, which I had learned here as basic sound economics. And so they said, really? And we said, yeah, we're going to do that. And I found a buyer for it who couldn't build a plant and they were going to close down the power plant and so we sold them the 20 years of relaxing. And the way we found the price of sulfur was backed into it based on the cost of capital. So we discovered the price of emissions allowances based on what they'd need to build the scrubber to reduce it. So it was the first trade. I get a call from the United Nations in 1991. They're meeting in Geneva to talk about a conference that would be held, which subsequently became the Earth Summit. And they said, hey, we heard you did something on sulfur. Do you think a carbon market's feasible? And I went there and I said, well, they said, no, it's not feasible. You could never do that. You know, the acid rain program, that's an economist trick. It's only taxes. Or I said, well, hold on. You know, they said, well, sulfur, that's a regional gas. I said, well, Russia burns coal. It goes into, the Scandinavian countries. Hold on. We have power plants in Arizona that go and drift over to Texas, 2,000-3,000 miles. The globe's 8,000-9,000 miles, but still, the model works effectively. And they said, no, sulfur is a single gas. And I said, no, it's much richer with carbon because you can not only fuel switch, You've got negative emissions. You can actually take carbon out of the air and sequester them. So you have, and you can take ag methane and stop that. You can do soil sequestration. You've got far more tools in carbon than you had in sulfur. In sulfur, you could burn different high sulfur, low sulfur coal. It was much richer target. So, make a long story short, I gave the paper in Rio, and separately in a side packet, my co-author was driving boats 1,000 miles up the Amazon with Jacques Cousteau. She's this high and from the Bronx, but boy, was she an explorer. And is. So Paula and I didn't meet, but it was like, think of a split screen movie. Here was she with Jacques Cousteau and Castro, and here was I in a tent for academics in a little corner saying you could have a carbon market. Fast forward, I get a call from UNCTAD, and they said, we can't go to Glen Cove. Would you represent our agency, the UN, and give an update on emissions trading and what you think? So I went to Glen Cove. I took Pena, my daughter, and I gave a talk, and I said, kind of, I like to do, because this is Minnesota, so Minnesota, I like to bridge theory and practice, okay? That's what I do. Minnesota's got great theory. I learned how to bridge it into practical, and that's what I do. And the only way to get a carbon market off the ground is to do a pilot, which I learned from Jack Schruckler's classes and other things. You need, when you're in inventive activity, you need a pilot. So I said, the only way to figure out if it's going to work is to do it. It's just too complex a mechanism, and you can't specify all the variables. And I looked around and I thought this was an epiphany, and the audience was dead-faced. It didn't ring a bell. Everybody looked like, this guy is from Mars. And what's he talking about? It's 1995. Carbon markets. I hardly believe in climate change, let alone applying a market-based solution. He's nuts. I get off the podium. Paula comes up to me, and Paula says, I was at Rio when you were at Rio. You don't know me. I thought that was great. Nice to meet you. We exchanged cards, and then 4 years later, she ends up being the head of the Joyce Foundation in Chicago. Calls me, we have lunch in Bastille Day. You can't do business, it's a business club. That would be commercial, and you're not supposed to do this in fancy elite clubs. So we sketched out on a piece of paper what would be the outlines for a voluntary market. And I basically said to Paula, this is what was done in acid rain. It's done, costs $3 billion a year. It throws off $150 billion a year in reduced medical expenses, 37,000 lives. People don't die. That doesn't include scenic benefits that result from trees not being defoliated. It doesn't include anything to do. And she said, but how do you, this is really complex. Nobody's going to understand cap and trade. So in the SO2 program, a fifth grade class in upstate New York was given a task to identify environmental problems, a group of 11-year-olds. And the teacher said, well, you can stop things by taxing them, you can encourage things by subsidizing, you can also put a cap on something and let a market go. So if Chairman Holmes is better at reducing than Richard is, well, he can double down and produce more, and I could buy it. So she said, how do I figure this out? So she gave out, there were 30 kids, and she gave out 30 chewing gum rights, okay? So there were a number of rights to chew during the day, and you can only chew for an hour. And all of a sudden, there were some kids that really loved chewing gum, so they bought the chewing rights from other kids, and they developed a whole cap and trade market. And actually, the class then went out, discovered acid rain. It was Glen Falls, New York. It was sulfur from Ohio Utilities. And they raised money from these chewing gum permits and actually bought a ton of SO2 and gave it to the American Lung Association. So I told Paula this story. She said, I think I can convince my board. And so we got a grant and started off.
Right, because you're going to tell us about the Chicago Climate Exchange. Is that the next step, or there's also a Kuznets curves floating around here somewhere?
Well, I thought that, basically, I'm going to make some Minnesota references. So I fought for an entire year trying to understand and managed to get through Cliff Hildreth's econometric courses. Chari, you may remember him. And so I said, even I can understand this is a good fit. There's something going on here. Now, I don't know if it's man-made or not man-made, Tom, and I think that scientists are getting burdened with making a policy case. And so I never approached it that this was necessarily man-made or not man-made. My argument was more like gambler's ruin, that you don't want to ever make a bet so big that no matter how good the odds are, that will bankrupt you, right? It just doesn't make, and it's a bad bet to fight that this isn't man-made. Not to say the science is perfect, but as an economist, I thought that the argument ought to be made, if you could do it cheaply, which we did with SO2, and you couldn't impose it, why couldn't you do it with climate change? You didn't have to argue the science of climate exchange. What you want to, I'm in the solutions business, and as a solutions, economist, why don't we apply this? So I use this kind of stuff, and I also believed, and why it's important for all of you to understand that when you're academically well-trained, it's harder to get scared out of a position, right? Or intimidated by a bureaucrat or an elected official. What I got at this university was the strength of my convictions. I said, hold on, that curve looks pretty damn good. If I take a look at history, and if I take a look at Kuznets, it turns out that, and take a little variation, that when you get rich, you can afford to take some of that money. If you're poor and you need food for the table, you can't worry about the environment. It's kind of, you have to have the caveman approach, right? You go out, you hunt the animals, you go into a cave. After you got the cave and the animals to eat, then you draw on the walls and become an artist, right? But this is the same thing. Environment is a privilege that you can undertake only when you've satisfied other human wants. So I was pretty much convinced, and I went to Paula, and I said, bring this to your board. I'd like to do a feasibility study on establishing. There was no law. And I mention this because it will sound very familiar to all of you. I said, let's start a market even though there's no law. And people looked and said, you're really not a well man. We just went to war. See if this sounds familiar. We have a new administration that is very conservative. This is 2001. 9/11 occurred, and you're going to ask people to do a voluntary thing like cut their emissions with no law. And I said, yeah, this is exactly the time to do it. Okay, you're supposed to, and I learned that with financial futures. You needed to sell it before interest rates became volatile, not after. Right? The commodity lesson is you buy umbrellas when it's dry and you sell them when it rains, right? Not vice versa. So the art was to start it when there was no apparent demand. So we got a grant for $400,000 to study the feasibility of establishing a climate exchange in the upper Midwest, because that was the Joyce Foundation's perimeter. And we started it, and it turned out it had a $2.2 trillion economy. It had agriculture. It had manufacturing. It had a whole total economy. And we said it's feasible. The board liked it. And so we applied a second step to see if it was feasible to start the exchange. And we went about trying to recruit people.
Yeah, well, you get this thing off the ground, and maybe you can explain a little bit about the mechanics here. It's the Chicago Climate Exchange, or the CCX, and companies would come to you and join, but they'd have to sign an agreement that would be legally binding, right? They would have to pay money if they didn't, meet the targets, right? So how do you get something like this off the ground?
So this is defying a lot of economic logic, okay? Or at this time, now we understand it because of behavioral economics, but we didn't understand it 63 years ago 64 years ago when I came to the Department of Economics here. It was then, technology was a great revolution to even include technology in the model. And then it was exogenous. It was never endogenous as a variable, let alone behavioral, maximizing different things. And so the real question and the heaviest lift of all was, how do you get people to change their behavior in a way that might cost them money when there's no law to do it? That was the heaviest lift of all. Who in the world? And everybody then said, you can't do that because nobody is going to do it. And I said, well, hold on, there's still considerable debate about the lighthouse, and there's a lot written about it, and whether people would, and it turns out there were 19th century for-profit lighthouses. I said, people, I think, are missing the key formula. And the key formula is what I call a mutual endowment effect. People tend to value resources they own more than those that they don't own, but I think there's a hidden agreement that Netsch's endowment effect doesn't explain why people join organizations like exchanges. They don't understand what the thrill and identity and value they get from being a member of the Chicago Board of Trade or being an alumni at the University of Minnesota, that people give lots of money because of a mutual endowment effect, and that economics doesn't really have it. And I have seen it because I've spent my lifetime among exchanges, mutually owned, capital owned, privately owned, that people want to be part of something that has a greater objective. So, from the quick studies, I went around the country. I crawled, I groveled, I begged, I cajoled, and I went to see 100+ companies, and I said, you have to join. And out of the companies, I came down to a simple thing, which was really a 2-page sentence that said, I agree to participate in the design of the Chicago Climate Exchange, and if and only if it serves my strategic business interests, I will join. Okay, I got them in the room now, okay? Of the 100+, I get 27 brave souls. And I convene, and I had had some experience because of Treasury futures and interest rate futures to know how to do it. And I divided it between manufacturers, power, forest products, farming. I said, each of you come down with the timetable, tell me the amount of cuts that you could live with. Here's a sample term sheet, and I will then take those and I'll hold another set of convenings and see where you are. Bring them together again, get it down to 2 groups, manufacturing and power. And you have, and I'm going to put American Electric Power in charge, which is the biggest coal-fired facility. You raise your hand in Chicago exchange politics that you don't like something, you become chairman of the committee. Okay, that's the ultimate reward for objecting in a board meeting. So, and I got Ford to head the other one. And fortunately, the guy from Ford is an MIT trained economist who is teaching and he gets it immediately. And the strategy guy gets it. We come up with a term sheet, and we get a baseline year, and we then write a second page. This is not a lot of work for lawyers, so this is an economist's view. It says, I agree to join the Chicago Climate Exchange and will be bound by the rules and regulations. So we had a 17-page Chicago Accord as opposed to 2,000-page Kyoto Protocol. And then we had a 95-page rule book, which governed the entities covered, the targeted reductions, the conflict resolution, the auditing, the compliance, etc. And the key was to get 4 or 5 people in a room together to jump in the pool at the same time. All right, how did we do it? So those 4 or 5 people are Ford Motor Company, okay? How do you convince them? Bill Ford, his father built this plant, or granddad, I guess, built this plant in Dearborn, which was mass production.
The Rouge plant, River Rouge, yeah.
River Rouge. And he wants to make a mark in history. And they've got plants in Stuttgart and Dusseldorf and Lyon. And he knows he's going to be regulated someday. So he can learn to comply. He can figure out all of the equations, paperwork, to internally look at it. And by the way, it forces him to look at fuel consumption, so maybe there's going to be efficiencies and it's going to not be the same thing. American Electric Power is the biggest user of coal in North America. And there's an expression in Chicago that if you're not at the table, you're going to be on the menu. Okay, and they didn't want to be in the menu. They knew that coal was not viable, so they were there. DuPont knew that it could change the refrigerant mix and CO2 and choice and things like that. There are these powerful chemicals that are so far more significant in their global warming factor, thousands of times versus a ton from coal. And so if you can change refrigerants a little bit, and they could make a lot of money. International Paper, the appeal to them was, look, you have a long-term solution here because you are the largest owner of land, and if you can figure out what to do, and once you get that, and DuPont also has seed production, and maybe you could, from technology, learn to basically genetically modify the seeds so they sequester carbon. We got 4. We ended up ultimately, the bottom line is 400 companies, 108 emitters, a group the size of Germany, and we cut emissions the annual amount of France. So the company, we developed protocols for soil sequestration, got the National Farmers Union to join. We had 15,000 farmers. We had sequestration projects in India with poor farmers in Kerala doing cow manure, methane capture as opposed to wood gathering. It saved and created schooling opportunities for young women who were often considered property in India, and it changed the whole nature of the village. And we had a micro system where they use carbon credits for currency. So that's where we ended up.
Okay, so that was quite a thing. And I want to add, University of Minnesota signed.
The University of Minnesota, Bob Brunix was then chairman, and you figured out how to make some money. And I want to say that maybe it's a short time to give a thank you to you, Tom, and to the economics department. And a special thank you to Ann and Julia, if you're out there watching. It was Jon Goldstein that did it. And this university, can claim a European Union trading system, pilot markets in China. All of the courses that I took from Hildreth, from Ann Krieger, from Leo Hurwitz, from Jack Schmuckler, from all of those, this department is a source of strength, and I think I do give a shout out to the department.
Yeah, absolutely. You literally use the word shout out.
Okay. So
no, and we appreciate it.
I want to say that if you look at all of these newfangled texts and look at the carbon adjustment border mechanism, where I know there's PhD students, there's biodiversity, that the subjects that the graduate students here are taking from really come from what went on in this campus in 1962. So that's a long time ago, 64 years ago. Right. So this department's strength is really so well beyond what you might think it is.
Right, but then what that ended up doing is, you create this company, and you're bringing all this knowledge about how important it is to, if you can grade it, you can trade it.
Right.
And that's another great quote, a mantra that's in there. But the way with the gases, we sometimes carbon dioxide, and just think of it as only one thing. Climate. When you designed this thing, you had 6 different. You've got methane, of course, being very different than carbon dioxide, fluorocarbons. And so you're doing all this measurement and setting up these markets. But would you say that a lot of this people were coming into it with the expectation that eventually it would be required, right? And so they were voluntarily doing this early on, maybe kind of just smoothing out compliance. But then once it, during the Obama administration, and they thought we were going to get cap and trade, and then we didn't. And so eventually, there was a point where you ceased trading. So how much, tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. We thought we had it really down pat, and I think we did. We hired FINRA, which was the old NASD, the monitor. We had all of the ability to fine people, to have non-compliance. We had the perfect model, we thought, which was perfect in every way, shape, or form in terms of a demonstration project. And we worked for 9 months. The legislative process was very brutal. We got through the House, we got through Waxman-Markey, and we contributed to a manager's amendment, and it's a whole lesson on colloquies and things that you say, how do you get voluntary in, and we managed to get all of that. And the political message was, even though it was passed in the House, 60 Democratic senators, a Democratic president, it failed. I don't want to get into why I think it happened, because that's not really appropriate, but let's say the legislative process in Washington politics, in spite of a passed amendment in Waxman and Markey, in spite of a bipartisan John McCain and a Republican-led in a 60 Democratic House, it failed. And fortunately, we had developed the European exchange, which is now the biggest one. So we sold the exchange to ICE. We took it public at £1. We sold it at £7.50. So the investors made 7.5 times their money. Even though there was no requirement, we gave the Joyce Foundation $1 million in stock, which they sold at a huge profit, just to say thank you. There was no contract, but they did that, and it went as a commercial proposition, and it died at the hands of politics. But
lives on in the DNA in the European. Right, so I want to hear more about that, the legacy of that, and in China.
And I want to end on a positive or take audience questions. I don't know if I'm talking too much. If I am, just cut me off.
No, we're here. Everyone's here to hear you.
Okay, so what did you learn during your summer holiday? I don't know if you guys ever did that. Lady, I did it as a kid, So what did I learn from my thing? So I learned that you could build an exchange and create a major economic value. I did learn that you could bring it to the consciousness, and I got cut off and frustrated because I had the Tata and Reliance, and I had the makings of an India climate exchange, which we sold to the buyer. I had the CNPC, which is the Chinese Natural Petroleum Corporation, the biggest company in China, as a partner. We developed the first climate exchange, and a month or two ago, Xi announced that they will go to carbon neutrality. There is a Guangdong exchange. I believe that the success of market-based solutions is directly proportional to the distance from Washington, D.C. So the further you go from Washington, D.C., the more you get adoptions of market-based solutions to climate things. So I think I will go out on the line, I'll come back and eat crow. I think you're going to have more, Beijing will have a cap and trade market before you will get Washington. But having said that, this economy is resilient. Lest you think that there may not be a legacy, remember one critical thing about the United States. What comes out of Washington, D.C. is Washington policy. It is not American policy. This is totally different. And if you take a look at the open interest in state markets, the state of California, the regional greenhouse gas, the breadth of carbon markets in North America is bigger than gold, even after gold has rallied $4,000 an ounce. This is as of yesterday. Carbon markets in America with no federal legislation are bigger than the gold markets. And the gold is at a level. So what do we learn? Justice Brandeis was right that maybe the states are the laboratories. And in fact, maybe like all carbon markets, this will be a bottom-up. That there'll be more action because environment is often a local problem, not a national problem. So voluntary markets go on. If you go up and look at something today, you can go, and as a young woman who started a company called Silicon, and if you go Google it right now, you can go into the Silicon database, plug in the AI that you're going to use, put every chip in that you're going to produce, and they will pump out a carbon offset for everything that you build in any data center. That's where the young, smart money is going. And if you want to do it, you can go into a voluntary carbon market, which a Minnesota alumni, Bob Litterman, is involved in, and there are others.
He's on the line, I think.
Okay, Bob, if you're there, so, and we gave him a thank you in the book, so you can go into that, and you can buy voluntary carbon markets, the standards of which developing. Well, you might say, well, what good is that? But go to 1865 and think about people who graded corn and wheat and judged the protein content by the yellowness of it, right? So just think that voluntary and standards are out there. So I've never been more optimistic about the ability for markets and entrepreneurship and technology, in spite of the lack of any federal policy. I always have an expression, I don't know if I did in the book, it's a bad thing to go short America's ingenuity, right? That's a bad trade. You never win by betting against American ingenuity. It's just a bad bet. So if you can't do it at the federal level, you do it at the state of California. Who's got wind? Texas. Who's got wrecks in electricity? Texas. Places that you would be totally surprised that the blue and red politics are often overcome by incentives. And incentives often can occur at the local level, not necessarily the federal level. So that's what I learned in my summer school.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was going to ask you about your food for thought, but I feel like we're getting some of that food and that optimism.
Yeah.
Because you might look at where we are and be very pessimistic, but you see the glass half full.
I really think that we're at the dawn, and Ellen's been involved in this, and between genetic modification and scientific visualization, which she does either because of the genome, DNA modification, AI. I think we're at an industrial revolution that we don't, I don't even think, I think we're going to be thinking about economists and worrying about jobs and robotics and what happens to aging in Japan and where does the labor come and declining populations in Italy. But I don't mind getting old. I just wish I could live for another 2-3 generations just to see what it was like 30 years from now when I've got a personal robot, telling me what I'm eating in carbon content, or something of that. So I tend to think we're at a great change, and I do think that the ingenuity of this system and economics and incentives, okay, should not be ever discounted. And if we take a look at what I say in the book, that if we look at incentives, transactions costs, expectations, and diversification, and design institutions and markets with those 4 factors in mind, and send unambiguous incentives, there will be consequences, and those consequences will be positive.
Well, that's very good. So I just want to wrap up with, you go back to Jon Goldstein, who you were a student together, you learned from him. How did your friendship with him influence your ultimate path, and what would he think about where climate markets are today?
I think Jon would be very happy. He was always a skeptic, and had a great sense of humor and always doubted things and whatnot. But I think he'd be very proud. He would be very proud about walking around and looking at the posters that deal with biodiversity that are out there, and the ones that are looking at climate change and things of this nature. And he'd say, oh my God, this is really a very different, and I think he'd be very proud and very happy to be remembered as somebody who was worrying about habitat and cost benefits of draining swamps and marshlands, and say, even he was, who was a doubting Thomas, would say, oh my God, the economics department is really pushing the boundaries. So I think he'd be very proud of it.
Well, we're all delighted. So let's all just give a round of applause. Thank you, Richard. And we have a mic, I believe. We have a mic planned here. Yes. So we're going to open it up for questions. Anybody have a question? Raise your hand. And Wes? What, we could always count on Chari for a question. The rest of you can think, but Chari can pull those questions out. No?
Oh my heavens, no.
No?
No. This is phenomenal. I mean, what you've done, it's a, the only thing I can say is, to me, this is the greatest tribute I can give anybody. Richard, you're a great American. We're all very proud of you. Sort of exemplify all the classical American optimism, go-gettingness, will get stuff done. So, and thank you for all that you've done for the department. This is a complicated question at some level, and I hope it doesn't get too technical. And that is, this is very much an academic question. In academia, one of the main questions that people have struggled with is the choice of market-based cap and trade kinds of systems, and the choice of systems that rely much more on taxes in order to get incentives right. Your instinct, based on our conversations over the last 20 years, has always been that markets are much better than having taxes. The academic literature is, to some extent, disagrees with you. I think with you, they're wrong, and you're right. But it stems from Marty Weitzman's work a long time ago. Could you give some flavor for why you think market-based systems are much more likely to be successful at addressing this issue than government tax-based systems?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chari, and I wonder about it and even ask myself, you know, are you so convinced? And in a perfect world, as we know, they're the same, or they should be. If you assume the right assumptions, they're going to turn out to be the same. And there was a guy who, Isaac Brazin, who was a member, or called me, and he was a inventor, and he was worked at MIT and a professor. And one of our members was Russian, and he had referred, before the animus that now exists between Russia and the US, and he called me up and said, I heard about this trading, and I've got a process where I take microorganisms, I split them on plexiglass, and I surround a smokestack with them, and those little microorganisms suck the carbon out of the air. And I can suck $100 million, and I see the price on carbon is $4. Can I make $200 million on your exchange? I said, sure, Isaac. You know, we would register the credits. Well, he got so excited, I didn't hear from him. He ultimately became Time Magazine Man of the Year, and he now is the principal inventor of green fuels. Okay, and he makes microorganisms. The price signal and the profitability, as opposed to, what's he going to call up the CFO of Honeywell or Triple M and say, I can save you X amount of money by saving you on taxes. It just does, the signal to inventors of a price and a commodity, and price times quantity equals revenue, is so easy and the same way with farmers to explain soil sequestration, or to go into Monsanto and say, if you design this DNA modified plant that has got roots instead of 8 inches, but 80 inches, and drills down 20 feet, they get real excited on price times quantity. So I think the incentive side is that. The second thing is, and I'm troubled by, and I am working on some things, because I think the next big breakthrough is going to come in pricing medicine appropriately, which, as you know, and we've discussed, is terrible. And the problem is, you get some bill like Affordable Care Act, and there were in Washington, D.C., because it was the same time we were doing it, there were 10 lobbyists for every legislator. There were 5,000 rent seekers. And I don't think the taxes work, because the rent seekers get a hold of it and can dilute the simplicity of a tax and turn it out, because the day that they're working on it, there are 10,000 people from the big four accounting firms had to arbitrage it. And I think that markets work because they don't permit the rent seeking, and they send a simple incentive out, a price. And that price, now, in theory, they should be the same. But my practical leaning is you put it in Washington and you put it in the federal hands, and you get 5,000 lobbyists, and they overwhelm the system. And markets, I'd like to see today, and I'm involved in some things, I'd like to make a bet on a rebirth of the CCX right now. That there are people, sorry.
No, different question. So Rachel Croson, I'm an experimental behavioral economist, so I was very interested in your behavioral part. But from my perspective, kind of looking from the 80s to today, the big thing that shifted is the consumer behavior in the space, the demand for green products, whether they're green or not, the willingness to pay an airline for, carbon offsets, that kind of thing. So maybe you have some insight into how did that shift happen, and is that actually going to either help create a market or maybe make a market not necessary?
Oh, yeah, I think the calculation tool that I mentioned right now with AI that's going on, and you go in front of classes, and I've been talking at universities since I wrote the book, and the awareness of the environment is, it's unambiguous, where the hearts and minds of young people are today. And the superiority of monitoring and verification and drones. We measured cropland by having the National Farm Bureau go out and look at fields of corn. Right now, you get drone stuff. You can go to NASA's site and get complete maps of every cornfield. We're sitting on 350 million acres. Just imagine if you could pull 5-10 pounds of carbon, tons of carbon a year in soil sequestration. When I was in Kyoto and one night maybe had a few more drinks than I should have with a couple of European negotiators, they said to me late at night in some Japanese bar, "We don't like this trading. We think you Americans do it better than we do." And you're going to come up with some Anglo-Saxon way of complying that we can't get. This is, as I sit here, hand on heart, we were going to be, too good at using markets, and there are a lot of people who don't. But I think the young people are more aware. The monitoring, the stuff that's going on, all of the models of free and perfect competition with no asymmetric information, things, it's coming to that. And why I'm so bullish about it now is Microsoft is already carbon neutral. Their customers of Google and all of these are the nerds of, God bless them, of the world, and they're not going to be fooled with, and they don't want to see a kilowatt hour double without NVIDIA paying its price and AMD paying its price and Google and ChatGPT, et cetera. All of these are consumer products very often, and I don't think they want to buy a good and service that really is environmental friendly. So I think that has changed dramatically because the emergence of the preponderance of when I came here, if you look at 45 to 70, wealth creation in America was manufacturing. Right? And if you look to the 70s to 80s, it was the commoditization world. It was the Arab oil embargo, Richard Nixon, crop failures in Russia, et cetera. In the 80s, it was the beginning of technology and Apple and Microsoft going public in 86, and it started all of that. And in the 90s, it was telecommunication. This is so clearly a digital age we live in, and the wealth creation is in the digital economy, not in manufacturing, not in the commoditization of financial instruments. Derivatives used to be hot in business schools, they're not. Now it's AI, and so the trends in the academics suggest it's a digital world. And people are now looking at, because I get calls all the time, hey, I want to put carbon credits on the blockchain, and this is what I'm going to do. And I want to do AI applications in the environment, and this is what my research is. So I hear this at universities, and I even hear among fellow economists people asking me about tokenization, the blockchain and AI, and what are the environmental uses that these new tools can bring to bear. They're interested, of course, still in money supply and tax policy and stuff like that, but I'm amazed at the number of questions I get about AI, blockchain, tokenization of water. I just gave a talk at Arizona State, and there's something called, which, what do I know, AWH. Has anybody heard of AWH? No. It's atmospheric water harvesting, and it's basically like you dehumidify a basement, right? You're getting these enormous things, and the questions surrounding is, what did you learn from carbon markets that we can use to commoditize atmospheric water harvesting? Who owns it? How do you allocate it? Those are the kinds of questions that are coming up, and that's what gets me bullish.
Yeah.
You know, who ever heard of that?
Well, we have a lot of young people, and we have some questions now from some of the young people.
Hey, I just had a quick question regarding the Australian cap and trade implementation and kind of everything that went down with labor and the Greens. And I think that they're at the ACCU now for their current system. So just kind of your thoughts.
I don't honestly know much about it other than it's been bogged down that in politics and politics between Greens and liberals. I always worry about that candidly, that I think, to me, it's, you know, we know that vengeance doesn't sleep, and Stalin spent a long time tracking down Trotsky because he wasn't left-wing enough. And so I really, get very concerned about, the communists who don't like the liberals or the Stalin, Trotsky syndrome, where people are not quite left-wing enough that all of a sudden, if you have a solution, I get that question a lot. People say to me, people are buying their way out of this. This is like indulgences. This is, this is Martin Luther and 95 propositions at Wittenberg. You're buying your way out of your sins. And I say, well, hold on a second. I got a different view. People made money from polluting. It's my job as a solutions guy to show them how to make money from not polluting, right? I'd like to turn the question. And I think so much of the fact that all of a sudden people are making money from doing, I had the conversation in Washington, D.C. around one of these things, and they said to me, well, you're making money, and I said, hold on, just hold on, what you do in your expression of morality, please express it on Sunday. I'm here to solve global warming, and you can go and deal with your church on Sunday, but here let's just solve the problems. And whether it's Australia and the United States, Isaac Asimov, the great scientific writer, had a quote, he said, never let your morality get in the way of doing what's right. Never let your morality get in the way of what's doing right. So I think there's too much confusion about, and I think whatever small success we had, Tom, and it relates to this, is focus, okay? Our job was to stop climate change, and we didn't get confused. Somebody said, I can do it by moving my cattle from here to here, and I can do it by having sheep and goats and do this. Can I make money? Yeah, come in, quick. We'll show you. If you can solve the problem, you're welcome to the party. And I think you have to be very clear, and Napoleonically clear. When Napoleon had bad successes in Austria, he called his generals in, and he said to them, when I told you to take Vienna, I meant take Vienna, okay? I didn't mean Salzburg. I didn't mean the mountains. I did it. The job is to focus on it and not to get confused with your objectives. I didn't mean to make it a long-winded answer, but the answer is, as a student of economics, if I know my objective and I know what I'm trying to minimize, I don't want to, then expand the objectives, because I never know what the trade-offs are between the objectives, and you get confused.
All right, well, maybe we get one more question. We have Wes.
I'd like to ask a question about the future of these carbon markets in places with less state capacity, such as India, for example. Do you think they're in places with less state capacity, where even more of an argument for carbon markets as opposed to a carbon tax or another regulatory policy?
The future of it?
The future of it in places with lower state capacity.
Yeah.
Okay. What is you think the future of it in places with lower state capacity is, such as India? Maybe I guess compared to other policies people could possibly implement.
Oh, look, I think it's a good way to end it. And it goes back to the Kuznets curve, and it goes back to water scarcity. And I, by the way, do think desertification may be more pressing than global warming, especially in the Middle East and South Asia, because if you get 300 million people on the march because they don't have water, and I say, like the Kuznets curve, you need to address some fundamental societal issues, and that is getting people clothed and housed at minimum levels. And you can only deal with markets after you provide a minimum degree. And just like I believe, and as another thing, that you can't, the income disparity in this country is far too wide, you know, and that confuses and causes problems in itself. But with water, like with carbon, we have a God-given right to have 25, 30 gallons a day for hygiene and hydration. You can trade water, but it's got to be anything above human needs, right? It can be, you can't, if you want to take a 3-hour shower, pay for it, okay? If you need 8 glasses of water, that's free. 10 gallons for hydration and toilet functions and hygiene, that goes without saying. 3-hour showers or Kentucky grass in Phoenix, Arizona, pay for that, okay? You can have it, just pay for it. So my feeling is that economic focus on environment comes after you supply the population with minimum standards of living. And it's only when you get to a sulfur dioxide world, or you get to Beijing, when the mothers start coming out because their kids have particulates and diseases and things like that, you know you better do something. And so I think you can only focus on environmental objectives after you have satisfied human needs of hygiene, health, food, and housing. And then you can worry about environmental objectives. Hey, it's great to be back here. Thank you all very much. This is a very meaningful place for me personally. My wife and I are married 63 years, and we came here 63 years ago. And thank you all for making my life and dreams come true. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, well, that was a lovely way to end. And we'll have a reception afterwards, and there's maybe time for some questions there. All right,
Good.
so very good. All right,
Thank
so
you.
we'll see everybody outside.